So let's look at human history in the quickest possible way. And this is all pretty measurable, I think, but feel free to look it up. The biggest evolutionary pressure in human evolution is what we would call basically glaciation or ice ages that push everybody towards the equator. The rain stops for 10,000 years or so, and all the plants die, except for the few small oases that might still be around. And then there's this grand period of time where our early primate ancestors, human ancestors as well as, depending on how far back you go on the ice ages, you'll see that, obviously primates would have, if they couldn't stay in trees, they had to do something else. And what happened, and this is called the aquatic ape theory, is human beings went back, or early human beings went to the beach and started eating mussels off of rocks. And then maybe they got the bravery as early primates to get into the ocean. And that's one of the two reasons why primates stand on two legs is anytime their paws are wet, they want to stand up to keep their face from getting underneath the water, right? And there's a bunch of other changes that you can see. So that's one thing to look at. After the ice, and I'll come back to the meditation part of this in a sec. After the ice age melts and we survive the floods and the earthquakes and the crazy things that make things like the Grand Canyon possible, we end up being wandering hunter-gatherers, maybe with a spear and a club, and the typical person with the tiger pelt across their chest for cartoon imagery and things like that. And we live with the land, as the land, for the land, based on the seasons and the weather and the climate and the biosphere. And then eventually we got really smart and got into, a bit of animal husbandry in the sense of herding animals, and then some passive agronomy, early agriculture. And then eventually we got really good at agriculture. And then we ended up in more modern versions of things, let's say the last 5,000 years, where the society was about defending the resources and the population in some way. And that's actually the four worlds in First Nations culture. So let's go on a tour of the evolution of human beings in that context as meditation. So here we are sitting on the beach for the next, say, 100 generations. And all we have as a memory is the last 10 generations of sitting on the beach. And there's day and night, yin and yang. There's good and bad days for weather. There's infinite food. There's no reason to fight over anything. Just imagine the waves crashing gently in the background. I wish I had that as a sound effect right now, but I don't. What would meditation be like if you were a meditation teacher 10,000 years ago or 15,000 years ago in the middle of an ice age when a younger proto-human comes up and says, hey, show me how to meditate. I'm bored. Or whatever. And meditation would be not that far away from that experience, because if there was no stimulation, no other people to fight with about anything, there's infinite food. And most of your existence is sitting around because there's nothing else to do because the world is in the middle of an ice age. We're this close to meditation all of the time. And it's not a surprise to me that when people want to go on to a holiday, almost implicitly throughout human culture, we all want to go back to the beach and just sit there and listen to the waves, because that's in indigenous cultures anyway, most of them, the memory of where human beings became human beings, just sitting somewhere between yin and yang, just hanging out. So if we go to the next world where people are hunter-gatherers and we're, on the land, as the land, for the land, dealing with you could say the chaos, the vicissitudes of fate, the good and bad things that happen because of the winds that move through life and change things. And when you look at early Chinese characters, which were initially invented marking cracked bones in fires to try and divinate things on the scapula of animals that people had harvested. Just take a moment and consider that Chinese cultural, the paradigm of that and the paradigms we're going to get into with Nei Gong practice and other things, started with Paleolithic hunter-gatherers beginning the process of becoming more organized around, agriculture and people with power. So if we're going to go back and think of meditation as hunter-gatherers, what is meditation, right? It's the winds, it's the seasons, that's the universe is the universe we observe and understand. The world you grow up in is your conditioning, and that conditions you to approach your meditation in that way. So as hunter-gatherers, there is no big sense of time. There is no hierarchy of enlightenment. It's just whether or not you're aligned with, sensitive to, and aware of what is innately going to happen on the inside is reflected on the outside, because we're just nature. At that point in our evolution, we're just nature expressing itself as nature for nature, right? Which is why I often say, we want to be, on the land, as the land, for the land in our Qigong practice, so that we're not in some big cause and effect process. We're not seeking out the magical prize of whatever it is the prize might be, because at any moment in hunter-gatherer reality, the weather could shift and the entire, way we exist can change. And that's where Chinese culture started, was at the kind of end of that hunter-gatherer experience. And a lot of the characters are kind of like cave paintings that describe experiences. Yeah, and I'll give you lots of examples as we go. So now let's say, just to keep the context consistent, we're now in China 7,000 years ago. Things are getting kind of organized. People are burying food consistently. Agronomy and early agriculture is getting so successful that we can now bury food in jars under the ground so consistently and have food for so long that we can now start having bigger populations, because more is better. Control over resources is wealth. Wealth is, in a way, security. Security, in a way, is longevity, but only for the people whoever has the power decides to have access to the food. So as early agricultural humans, now meditation is a conditioned experience about accumulating something. And we see this in the evolution of Qigong. We see this in the evolution of other traditions, where you're there to get something and get more of something. And for some people, more of something is less of the confusion, because if you have less confusion, you have more consciousness, more presence. But it's that distinction between less and more, having and keeping and accumulating causing a kind of power, or a kind of hierarchy of more or less enlightened, more or less, something. So when we approach our meditation in that context, again, we're all conditioned by our existence in that way. We're in a bit of a tight spot, because we're not seeking what is, we're seeking what we could get, like enlightened. Or this funny mistranslation of one of the early Chinese descriptors about all this stuff. It gets translated as being immortal, instead of being like the hill wandering people who still remember what human beings and human life were like. Because that's what the character Xian for immortal is. It's one of those crazy mountain people, right, who still lives the old way, wandering around in the forest, as the land, on the land, for the land, right? So we can remind ourselves that less is more, or we can fall prey to more is more, right? And now meditation, Qigong practice is accumulating more Qi in your Dantian, so you can shoot fireballs out your hands like video games or something. It can go in all kinds of places. And I'm not going to go very much farther with this, but if we go into what we call the fourth world, now we're in this idea of systems versus systems, religions, where you either go to heaven or hell, and it's sort of you're in or you're out of the castle, depending on your culture and history. And by the way, this is a history of every culture in the history of being human. So what I'm speaking to is obvious in a way, but the context for this conversation about Nei Gong is we want to go backwards and re-experience or remember what it is like and was like to live that way. There are still people who live in some ways kind of on the beach, just chilling out. There are still tribal peoples in the Amazon who've never seen modern humanity, who live as hunter-gatherers, right? There are still people kind of doing herding and agronomy, even in parts of Southern Europe and throughout the Middle East and other places, where that world still exists today, right? So instead of having to think of it as a causal stream of time, notice it's like a circle, and we're able to touch in with any of those worlds, any of those ways of looking at meditation, looking at ourselves as beings, anytime we choose to. But if we really track down, like good sleuth detectives, what Chinese characters are implying, what why they're always attributing things to go as far back as possible, is because that's when we remember what it is that we are and have been for the longest period of time. This new stuff is like agriculture in Europe is 6,000 years old in a really considerable, significant way. And modern society is, what, 150 years old, maybe. And nowadays that we have the internet and social media, we're kind of in this whole other paradigm as well. And this brings me up to traditional teaching about meditation. It's called 走观 in Chinese, which means the barrier of sitting.